Hello everybody, welcome back to the Atypical Engineer channel. My name is Greg and today we are learning about stateful components in React. This is an extremely important feature and because components have state built into them, it allows you to basically encapsulate all of their logic into just your component code and hide your information from your parents and children, which basically makes it so that you can write independent modules and what makes React so cool. So local state inside components is super important. That's what we're talking about today. A quick overview of what we'll be covering. This is the second video in a two-part video series about local component state in React. And in this video, we will be first adding an input component we'll be using React Semantic to add an input component and taking user input from the keyboard in that component, and then we'll take the values that you type into that input box and we'll store those values in the local state. In the last video, you just initialized the state. Now we will actually change the state based on some keystrokes, and then we'll pass that state value back into some other components so you can see the values that you're typing being reflected in real time on the screen. If you haven't watched the last video and you don't really know what I'm talking about, you should go back because in that video I talk about the concept of local state in React components. We go through the process of setting up a class component, which is required to have local state. And then we also just do initialization of the state in the constructor. So the last video is kind of the basics. This one is about managing state, setting it programmatically, and using it to display things on the screen. In this video, we will add an input box into the project that you will be able to type into, and the input of that will be stored in the local state, and then it will be passed into the header that we built in the last video, and the header will display the information, and all of this update will happen in real time. So you'll get to see how easy it is in React to create an input form and pass that information, store that information in a component, pass it to another component. All of this will basically be reused in the final project. So the final project, if you weren't aware, is that there's this little search bar and you can type the name of a Pokemon in it, and then it will hit a backend API, and that will return some information, and you'll display information about that Pokemon on the screen. So that's kind of the thing that we're building. This video, though, is just an intermediary video, but very important. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. An input text box is our first experience in this project of taking user input. So now the user will be able to control the internal state of your component, and they'll be able to control what's rendered on the screen. And this is a pretty important part of front-end programming and an important part of React. So to do this, fortunately, in a previous video, you've set up React Semantic UI, and they have a component that handles user input really nicely. So we're going to go over to the documentation and just check it out real quick. You can go over to the React Semantic homepage, and you'll just find the input thing on the sidebar here, and you'll click, and you can just kind of browse the input. There's a whole bunch of different options, but we're just going to use one of the most basic options we can find. So let's go over to the code. And first, as usual, when we use React Semantic UI, we need to import the component we're going to use. So we're going to import a component called input from Semantic UI React. And then down here below the Pokedex header, we're just going to start out by adding an input component. So that's it, just an input component, and then we'll save and we'll check out what we've got over there. And we can see that we have an input component, but this, this obviously looks kind of bad. I don't really like how that looks. I want some spacing between the top, like dark section of the header and the input component. So to do that, we're going to use React Semantic UI segment component. And now you can start to see how this is working. So React Semantic has a bunch of kind of layout and spacing components like segment. Another one is called container. Another one is called grid. And you kind of use these to group other components that are actually functional components. And that's like header, which you're using in the header there. There's an image. And now we're using the input component. So we'll go over to the code. Let's import segment. And now let's just wrap the input in a segment component and save. And let's check out what happens. That looks a little bit better. Okay, but I don't like the box shadows, and this happened in the previous video because the header there is also a segment. So let's just pass in a prop called basic to our segment. And now when we go back over, we can see that we have something that looks decent. There's some spacing, and there's a little input box. So I'm okay with how this looks right now. Let's continue and move forward. Now, one thing when you're doing user interface programming is that the user generally doesn't know what you want them to do. So typically when you have input fields, you want to label them so that you can kind of guide the user through the experience. This is actually a really important part of user interface programming, and one that many programmers don't really pay very much attention to. So we know that we need to do something to tell the user what they need to put into that text box. The input component actually has a way to do this, and you can click on, so if I do command Apple, like the Apple key, and click on the component, VS Code will navigate into the TypeScript file for this component, and I'll be able to check out all the properties. Okay, so you can see that I have this list of all the different properties for input, and I can also check these on the Semantic UI website. So I can go and see, but this is like way faster. So I see up here that there is there's an optional label to display alongside the input. So let's try this. So we'll go back to the app.js, and I'm just going to say label, and I'm going to call it input form a string. And then I'm going to save, and boom. Oh, now I have like a nice little input form. So you can put whatever you want here. This basically tells the user what they need to input into the form. And now if you go over and you just type a bunch of stuff, you can see that it takes input and nothing is really happening, but at least you are taking user input. That's a good first step, right? Part of programming is like, let's just get to a stage where we're doing one thing and then we'll figure out how to do the next thing. So we're taking user input, but we're not actually doing anything with it. So to do something with it, this is going to be kind of a several step process that we're going to walk through. First of all, we're going to programmatically set the value of the input component. And we're going to programmatically set that to whatever you want. And then the next step will be to programmatically set that to a value that's maintained in your state. So the same state that we passed into the header just a couple minutes ago in this video, we're just going to set the value of this input field to that state. All right. But still, you're going to find that when you type in the component, nothing's going to work. So we're going to have to give the input component a callback, and it will call that function when something in the input field changes, and then that function will change your internal state to whatever is now in the input field. And then because your internal state changes, a re-render happens, and now the input will render the value from the state into the input field on the screen. And that's how this whole thing is going to work. Okay, so let's just start from the beginning. We're going to programmatically set the value of the input with a hard-coded value. So we'll go over to the code. We're going to say value equals to test value. All right, and now if we save, we just see that value over there in the input field. And this is what we should expect. But the other thing that we should expect is that if we type something in that input field, nothing actually changes, because now we're overriding the value passed to that component with something with test value. And every time that something changes, like if you type in there, the value is not going to change. It's still test value. So let's go over and test that. Okay, and every time I type now, there is nothing showing up. Nothing is changing. Okay, because no matter what I do, I'm overriding the value in the input field as the test value. Okay, that makes sense. Step 2 is what I said was to use the value in your state as the value in the input field. So now let's go back to the code and let's type this.state.name. You notice this is the same value as we're using in the Pokedex header. And so we'll set this as this.state.name and we'll save. And now when we go over, we can see that the input form value is the name. Okay, so this shouldn't surprise you. This should be expected. So that's good. But now the question is, how do we update the state so that whatever you type in the field gets reflected on screen? So to answer this question, what I said before, we have to pass a callback function to the input component. This is passed the same way as other props are passed. So let's once again dive into the input TypeScript file. And right here, we see that we have a prop that we can call that's called onChange. And this is we can pass in basically a function that takes that has two parameters, okay, something called an event and something called data. So what we know we have to do now is we have to write a function that takes in two parameters, event and data, and we have to pass that function to the input component. And then when something in the input component, when you type something in the input component, the component will call that function with some values, and we can do whatever processing we want on those values. So let's go ahead and do that. Go back, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a function in our class called onChange, and we'll give it two arguments, event and data. And now we will go down and we will just give the function name in the onChange. And it's not going to work initially. We have to say this.onChange. And I don't want to get into all of the things about this, but this is a keyword. And in this case, it's referring to the instance of the component that we are working on right now. So this.onChange is saying this component's instance of onChange. And then we're saving, and nothing is still happening, but we should at least be getting the function called. But we can't really tell because the function's not doing anything. So let's go in and just add a console.log in the event and a console.log of the data. And this will log each argument onto our browser console, which is cool. This is like the printf debugging of JavaScript. Okay, but it's really nice in a pinch in how I do a lot of debugging. So you can right click and then inspect your page. And then somewhere you should have a console. And now when I type, every time I hit a key, I see that I'm getting two objects printed out. One object, the top object, is the event, and the bottom object is the data. And when I expand the data, I see that there's a field called value, and that looks like it's what I'm typing. So my name is Gregory, and after the second G, I typed an O, and now that value is Grego. Okay, so that's actually exactly what we want, isn't it? Anytime something gets typed, there's a change in what that value should be, and then the input component is calling this onChange function, and it's passing data into that function, and now I can see that that data has a value of the thing that I just typed. Okay, and it'll do this on every single keystroke. So that is awesome. Let's go and change the console.log to just log that one piece of data that I'm interested in, the data.value. Okay, and now you can see that every time I hit a different key, the console just prints whatever the result would be. So I type ORY, and the console is typing Greg O, and then Greg R, and then Greg Y. All right, so every time that you hit a key, this function gets called. It passes the data in. So you might be predicting what the next step would be. And that would be to set the state, to set the name field of our internal state to be equal to that value that's being passed into the callback. Okay, so the way that we do this is that there's a special function called this.setState, and you always want to use, outside of the constructor, you always want to use setState to change your internal state. So we will call this.setState, and into setState we will pass an object that has the name as a key and data.value, the new value that's being passed into the onChange callback. Okay, so every time a keystroke hits, the input component will call the onChange function. The onChange function will get the new value in through the data argument, and then we will call setState with our name to equal the new data value. That's what's going on right now. So when we stave, we're kind of expecting this to work. Logically, it makes sense, but it's actually not going to work. And the reason it's telling me is that this.setState is not a function. Okay, and the reason that this is happening is because we didn't bind the onChange function to our instance, to this instance of the app component. We're not going to get into binding functions to the this object in this video. That's outside the scope of this video. But if you're declaring functions inside of a React component class, and especially if you're passing those functions as callbacks to other components, then you need to make sure that you bind your functions to your component. So we'll just go through the syntax of how to do it in this video right now. We'll go back to the code, and if you remember earlier in the video, I said that the constructor had two purposes. Number one was to do initial population of the component's internal state, and number two was to bind callbacks to that component. Below the state declaration here, we will just type the following line. We'll type this.onChange equals this.onChange.bind with this as an argument. And again, I'm not going over the syntax. You can just go ahead and copy this line into your project. And now, if we save this and then we go and we type into the input field again, we are going to see what we want to see, which is that whatever you type shows up in the input field. And moreover, it's actually showing up in the header as well. So if you remember, we set the Pokedex header, the value to this.state.name, and as we can see, when we're modifying the input field, we're getting that value in the header as well. So now we're programmatically controlling what is being rendered, and that's a pretty cool accomplishment. Before we wrap up this video and commit our code, there is one more concept that I do want to talk about, and that is the concept of how often this render function is called. If you remember in the very beginning or earlier in this video, I mentioned that the render function is called every time you update the internal state of a component. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of verify that just for our understanding. And in the process, we'll learn about something else called component state merging. The first thing we're going to do, though, is we're just going to get rid of these console.log lines and any extra spaces we have just so that we can start to clean up our code preemptively. Then we're going to go ahead and add a new field to our state. And the reason here is that we will add a second field to our state, and then we won't modify that field in our setState call. And the goal of what I'm trying to get you to see is that calling the setState field on an object with only the name key isn't going to overwrite a second key that was initialized in your constructor. Okay, so all of this is a bunch of jarble. Let's go ahead and actually implement this so we can see what we're talking about. Step number one is to add another field to your initialization process in your constructor. And what we'll do is we'll just add a field called author, because we're already passing a prop to the Pokedex header component called author. So when we add this author field, we'll just go down to the Pokedex header and we'll copy the value, and then we'll paste the value up in the state initialization. So now I should have something called this.state.author, which is set to this hard-coded value. And what does that mean? Well, that means I can go down to the author prop in the Pokedex header and set that prop to this.state.author. And if I save this, then we should expect that the author in the subheading of the Pokedex header remains the same exact value. And you can see that this is the case. So we can go ahead and move along now. When I type again, we're seeing the proper input. We're seeing the name appear in the header. All is well. Okay, but what I want to do is I want to show you that the render is getting called every time you type a new keystroke, because every keystroke is updating the internal state. So let's go back to the code and let's just type a console.log, and we will log this.state right at the beginning of the render function. So now what you can expect is that every time the render function gets called, there's a line printed out to the console that prints the value of the state object. And all of the values, all of the fields that are in the state object are going to get printed when you call this. So let's go ahead and save, and then we go over to the browser and we call inspect, open up our console, and now we will first just look and see that the object, the state object, was printed once already. And that's because it has to call render once when it loads and mounts the component. So that's obvious, that has to happen. But now if we go up to the input field and we just start typing, we see that we're starting to get more console logs. And each time I type an additional letter, you can see that the name field in the this.state object is changing. Okay, and it keeps appending whatever letter I'm typing on. But really, it's sending that entire new value, and you're setting the entire state. It's not really like, to your visibility, it's not appending anything. You don't need to know what's going on under the hood. And then the other key is that even though you're calling set state with an object that only has name in it, you're not overwriting the author field. It's not like you are giving it a new object that no longer contains an author field, and so now your state won't have author field anymore. You still have the author field. You can see it right there, and it doesn't leave from the Pokemon header when you type. Okay, so you can play around with this. You can do whatever you want, but you can see that the render function is getting called whenever you update the state. And now it is time to commit our code and call it a day. So let's go on over to GitHub Desktop. Here in GitHub Desktop, we can see on the left that we've only changed one file. So let's just go ahead and review the code that we've changed real quick. First, we have imported two components, the input and the segment component from Semantic UI React. Next, we have added a field to our state called author and filled that field in with whatever we want our author name to be. We have called bind on the onChange function so that it is bound to this instance of our component. And we have added an onChange function that calls setState on the variable name with an argument anytime that this function is called. If we continue to scroll down, we see that we have set the author in Pokedex header. Now we've added this this.state.author to the Pokedex header, so now this is using the state. And the main piece here is that we have a segment that wraps an input box, and there's a label on that input box, and we are setting the value of that input to the internal state variable of name, and we're also giving it a callback with which gets called when you change the input into the text box. So these changes all look good. This is normal. Let's go over to our little message box and let's give the commit a title. In the title, let's just say added an input form that is tied to local state. And then in the description, let's just say that we added an input form that sets local component state and displayed that state in the Pokedex header. And now that we have done that, we'll just press the commit to master button. And that's going to commit these changes to our master branch. And now we'll go back into the main area here, and it gives us the option to push to our remote. And let's go ahead and do that. So we'll push our changes up to GitHub. And now we are done. Great work. That was a big lesson. State is a really important piece of React, especially local state, that state that's local to a component, because components are the idea around which React is really built and used. So in this video, we added an input component using a UI library, React Semantic UI, and we took keyboard input from the user, and then every time the user pressed a key, we updated our internal state and then displayed that state in multiple other components. So that's a really cool concept. It's a pattern that will be repeated many times throughout your React journey. If you didn't check out the first part of this video, make sure you do that. Otherwise, you can look forward to more videos upcoming. I think the next one in the series will be related to component lifecycle, which is another hairy topic in React, but still a beginner's topic that is really important to understand. So make sure to keep your eyes out for that video. If you like this video or you have any questions or comments, please just leave the comments down there and I will answer them. And thank you so much for watching. See you next time. Have a great day.